Good morning and welcome to NFL Mock Drafts with Aaron Schatz and Mike Tanier, special guest Benjamin Robinson. It is the Schatz and Tanier podcast / live stream from FTN Fantasy. I am your host, Aaron Schatz of FTN Fantasy. He is Mike Tanier from the Too Deep Zone, which you find at miketanier.substack.com. And we are joined this week by Benjamin Robinson of Mocking the Drafts, grinding the mocks. He mocks the drafts and he grinds the mocks. Grinding the mocks. And thank you all for joining us in our irregular podcast and live stream. A reminder that our sponsor is Underdog Fantasy because it's Major League Baseball season. And the easiest place to play fantasy baseball is at Underdog Fantasy. I believe that they still have best ball fantasy drafts. And so you want to get involved in that. Underdog Fantasy, that is our sponsor. I have a read here, but it's all about the preseason. So I need to get a new read for next week. Next week, we're going to get a new read that's about the season. But Underdog Fantasy has drafts throughout the season. And so you want to check it out. All right. So we want to talk a little bit about the draft. I am admittedly not a draft expert, although we do have, some of those systems that we used to use at Football Outsiders that I've done for ESPN Plus. This week, if you missed it, Sack Seer and Backcast, which is the edge rushers and the running backs, ran last weekend on ESPN Plus, and Cubase and Playmaker Score, which is the wide receivers, will run this weekend on ESPN Plus, and then next Thursday's podcast, we're going to talk about those systems. But today, because we have Benjamin here, we want to talk about which players have been rising and falling in mock drafts over the last month or two. So I wanted to start with which players were rising and get your thoughts and Mike's thoughts on these players. But what's interesting is there's something that sort of connects a lot of them. So Benjamin, what are your top 5 players that have been rising in mock drafts over the last few weeks?
Yeah, so looking at the Grinding the Mocks top 50, so Grinding the Mocks, we take mock drafts, we use kind of machine learning and the power of the wisdom of crowds to come up with projections that have been proven to be very stable and accurate over time. We've been doing this since 2019. So in our data, looking at the top 50 players, the players that have risen the most over the last month adjusted for draft position. So if you go from like 50 to 55, it's not as big of a deal as you go from 5 or 1 to 5 to 1, for example. That's a huge jump, right? So our top 5 risers over the last month in our data: Michael Penix, quarterback from Washington; Bo Nix, quarterback from Oregon. We got Layatu Latu, edge rusher from UCLA; Graham Barton, offensive tackle, but he's probably going to play interior in the NFL, from Duke; and then another quarterback, Jaden Daniels, from the Heisman Award-winning quarterback from Louisiana State University. So we have 3 quarterbacks. I think the Jaden Daniels is probably him solidifying himself right now in my data as the 2nd overall quarterback versus the 3rd or maybe the 4th overall player, depending on where he was over Marvin Harrison Jr., the wide receiver from Ohio State, or beneath him. Now kind of solidifying himself in that number 2 spot. And the quarterbacks are the quarterbacks. I'm sure we'll talk more about that. I'm really intrigued by Latu. I think that he was kind of thought of as, someone who had a lot of medical concerns, a lot of production, very good edge rusher, not necessarily the most physically imposing edge rusher, but just someone who, quote unquote, just like is really good at football. And then Barton, I think people are kind of seeing him as an athlete. And then also they see the versatility. He played tackle at Duke. He will play potentially on the interior, both at center and potentially at guard. You see that as well with a guy who's not on this list, with Troy Fautanu from Washington, who people are also talking about. Versatility can be something that can be really positive in your favor, especially on offensive line, where the kind of depth on teams not strong. Not as many big guys out there.
Yeah, I love Fautanu too. I think of him as a left tackle. Barton played center at the Senior Bowl. So it's kind of like preordained that he's going to come into the NFL as a center. And I think that's why he rose up the boards, because he went from kind of one of the tackles who was pretty athletic, had an outstanding pro day too. I think that helped him jump up along the way to somebody who I think is now the number 1 center on a lot of boards. Now you alluded to the fact that the jump from 5 to 1 is more impactful in your system than the jump to like 50 to 40. Is that really what we're seeing with Daniels? You mentioned Harrison. He's probably jumped over Drake May as well in mocks over the last 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah, so about a month ago, what I think was happening was that it was Williams, May, and then Daniels, but then sometimes people kind of are a little stubborn. They don't think, oh, like, the Patriots may not want to take a quarterback. Their roster, is not in a good shape. They're not going to want to get a quarterback and just put that quarterback in the roster that they have. They're going to want to build up the roster and maybe take a quarterback or do something in the future, which is, there's a little bit of folly there, but they could, if they don't take a quarterback in this draft, they could be really bad this year too. It wouldn't be that hard necessarily. But to me, I think the solidifying of, I think May and Daniels have switched positions to a certain extent, with Daniels kind of being more seen by a lot of the media and folks in that number 2 spot. I think that when I put out my final mock, I'll probably have May at number 2, just because I think a lot of people are just kind of talking. I don't think it's necessarily super well sourced, or if it, yeah. So like, to me, like, I think May will end up at number 2 eventually, and how I see it. But yeah, him and May have kind of switched spots, with, May being sort of like the number 3, but also he could fall depending on, what happens with all the discussion around JJ McCarthy. And if you think that, team might decide to switch and pass on a quarterback, that, Marvin Harrison Jr. can get slotted in there to pretty easily to the number 3 for the Patriots, number 4 to the Cardinals, even number 5 to the Chargers, if those teams don't end up engineering a trade. And there's a lot of discussions around trades going on in mock draft, specifically around the Minnesota Vikings, but also around teams like the Las Vegas Raiders and the New York Giants.
Yeah, well, and when you talk about Penix and Nix in particular, it goes down to like the quarterback math of the first round. And that's a little bit with the Patriots too. I mean, Aaron and I were in Indy, and you were in Indy too, Benjamin. And there was still talk about what you said. The Patriots might just say, heck, we'll get a free agent quarterback, or, we'll do this other thing and get Harrison. Now I've kind of got like, Bears 100% quarterback, obviously, as Williams. Commanders 100% quarterback. I got Patriots 100% quarterback. But then when you go down a little bit, I got the Vikings at like 95, 97% quarterback at this point, since Sam Darnold's number 1 on their depth chart, since they have 2 first-round picks. I got like the Broncos at like 70% drafting a quarterback in the first round. I got the Giants around 50, even though it should be 99. It's 50. I got the Raiders at 50. When you do that rapidly, you have to grab Nix and you have to grab Penix and you have to put them in the first round to accommodate these teams that are at least feasibly in the quarterback market.
Yeah, it sort of is an interesting question of whether the quarterbacks end up more like last year, when we all thought like Malik Willis was going to go in the first round, and Levis and Willis ended up dropping in the draft much further than mock drafts had them. Or if it's more like 2021, when the quarterbacks just all went. The quarterbacks just went. Real all first round, 5 first round guys, 5 top half of the first round guys. We took a look at the data here from the Grinding the Mocks data on the quarterbacks and when they're going to go. Mm-hmm. So, Ben, like, what is the expected draft position of these top quarterbacks?
So as we laid out, Caleb Williams from USC, Jaden Daniels from LSU, Drake May from North Carolina are the consensus 1, 2, and 3 players. JJ McCarthy from Michigan, the national champ, we have going around the 7, 8 spot. There's a lot of people who have him go higher, but the way that my model works is that it rates mock drafters who have a stronger history of performance. Okay. And so when those come in, they tend to be weighted higher than the ones who just are kind of, I heard Nate Tice on the Athletic Football Show called mock draft kind of like football fantasy alternative histories or something like that. Okay. And yeah, fan fiction. And so, JJ McCarthy has been one of the biggest risers, since the end of the season. But yeah, he is kind of in that top 10 for sure. And then you have Nix and Penix, who I think people were thinking, oh, like they're probably second round guys or late first round guys. And now I think some of the groupthink around quarterback to some of these teams that Mike was saying, I think if you look at the positional numbers in terms of like what percentage of my mocks are for the Broncos or quarterback, is probably too high in the first round. They have such little draft capital. And so like that's a huge problem for the Broncos.
There does seem to be the feeling like they're willing to go into the season with Stidham as the quarterback.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, they're the quarterback like class. Like you could take quarterbacks outside of the first round. Like
Yeah.
you can do it. So I mean, I think that there's value in taking a guy like Nixon Penix in the second round. I mean, I know the Broncos. I'm not sure if they have a second round pick, but the Broncos are a team I think who should be looking to trade down. A lot of teams that don't have a lot of draft capital should be looking to trade down with teams that are, you want to take advantage of people moving up in this class. I've seen all kinds of discussion about, this class is not as packed with impactful players. We know people tend to estimate their ability to predict these things in advance.
Right.
And so teams that should be willing to trade down, because I think a lot of teams are taking a look at this, and I think that they understand the market a lot more than they do. And so I think if you lack draft capital, like your team, like the Broncos, trading down, I think is really the right way to go, especially where they are in their team cycle. Like they have so many, they need more draft picks. They need help. And, one of the problems is that Sean Payton loves to trade up. And so you saw it last year with a guy like Marvin Mims, who was a good prospect from Oklahoma.
No, but it's that overconfidence. It's that overconfidence that scouting people have, that they know better than everyone else, and therefore that they, whereas if there's anything we've learned from analytics in the draft, it's that people should feel like they should have underconfidence.
Yeah.
They should feel like, you don't know as much as you think you know, and therefore you want as many shots at the apple as possible. You want as many lottery tickets as possible, and trading up really only makes sense for quarterbacks.
And of course, the flip side of that is if you know the market and everyone's trying to trade down, then that diminishes the value of trading down, because you have less trading up partners. By the way, the Broncos don't have a second round pick. So, like, I could definitely see the logic of that. I could also see the logic of them hungrily grabbing that quarterback. Like I said, I have them at like 50% or something like that, because Sean Payton's following.
Yeah, I agree that they will probably draft a quarterback at some point. The thing about specifically a guy like Penix, I overall like, if you just look at him as a player, just forget about everything else. I generally like his profile in the second round. I do.
Yeah.
The problem with his profile, if you look at just beyond the play, he has an injury history and he's older. And you look at a guy last year like Hendon Hooker, and it's not the same, because Hendon Hooker had that bad injury that happened during the season, the ACL. But people were still mocking him in the first round this past year, and he went in the third round. So there's a chance that people don't have the medicals on Penix. But I've seen a lot of really, I think it'll start to be a little more telling as we get closer to the draft. Like, it's a little unfair, but like, the mock drafts that are released right before the draft, I weight a lot higher, and that can really change things. So, for example, let's say that normally we have a mock draft like Daniel Jeremiah puts Michael Penix to the Raiders at 12 or 11 or whatever. And people are like, okay, well, that gives me credence in my mock drafts to put Penix higher. Yeah. Well, that takes time to diffuse through like the mock draft community, like the draft community. When Daniel Jeremiah puts out his mock draft right before the draft, no one has time to react. So like you get these numbers, but then like there's this sort of weird moment where like the best mock drafts that I have, I try to weight them really high, but then there's also people who are, not going to be able to respond to the information that Jeremiah has. So like, to be honest, like I'll be paying close attention to those the day of the draft when they start coming in. But yeah, I think there's maybe a possibility that, Penix goes low because of the combination of age and the injury history, and maybe the Broncos can pick him up in the third round. And then this draft is more like the 2022 draft than it is like the 2021 draft, or even last year with 23, where people thought Hooker might go in round 1, and same thing with Will Levis, and we were both wrong on that.
I think the Giants also lack a second rounder because of the Burns trade, if I'm remembering correctly. So that does impact this idea that you can swing back in the second round. I may be wrong, though. Check this out real quick.
Matthew Carley wants to know, Ben, do you have a list of which mock drafters who are actually good and who we should be listening to?
Yeah, I can pull that up. When I look at the last, like my top 5 mock drafters over the last like 5-6 years, so not in any order, Lance Zierlein from NFL Network, really well sourced, really smart guy, very diligent. Dane Brugler from The Athletic, also very smart, very diligent. They used to do the NFL or the Athletics Prospects to Pros podcast together, and that was always appointment listening for me, just because you get them together in a room and it's amazing. Then there's some ones that you don't think about as much. one of my top mock drafters is Charles Davis from NFL Network.
Good.
Just like not many people think of him as someone who's like a really good analyst, but he really is. Like I always enjoy listening to him to do color commentary on games, and he's just a pretty good analyst. I think people just discount him because he's not a big name. And then the other two names, I have Michael Mittelhurst Schwartz from USA Today.
Oh, good.
Had a really good mock draft last year. Actually, his best mock draft last year was the one the week before the draft, and then the week of the draft happened and he changed a bunch of things. But he's pretty solid mock drafter as well in my data. And the last one is one that I think always hits people a little hard. Walter Cherepinski from Walter Football is actually pretty well sourced. So his website looks like it's from like the 2000s, the aughts. And I wouldn't necessarily read too much into some of his like thinking when he makes those mock draft picks. Like it'll be all over the place, but the mock draft is pretty solid. And so, yeah, like that's those are my like top 5 like mock drafters that you should pay attention to.
Arif Hassan on his Substack just did a 5-year study on mock drafts too.
Oh, the big boards, the consensus big boards. Yeah.
Consensus big board. And he has a lot of information there too.
Yeah. Yeah, wide left. That's the
wide left
for Arif Hassan. Yeah.
We talked about where your data has Williams, Daniels, and May 1, 2, 3. McCarthy more like 7 or 8. What about Nix and Penix? So at this point, what's their expected position?
So they both are around the like 19, 20 area. They're really, really like neck and neck. I kind of view them at the same. They're kind of in the same position at this point, which leads me to think that potentially people are kind of picking one or the other. And so, to me, like we also look back historically at quarterbacks, and the 2018 draft was really a bumper crop where we had like 5 or 6, right?
Rosen,
Mayfield,
Darnold, Jackson,
Darnold, Rosen, Lamar, Josh Allen, and that's a lot. That's historically a lot. Yeah. And people always put like 6 quarterbacks, and it kind of annoys me because it kind of poisons the well for the accuracy in my data. But we usually see 4 being kind of a top line. Like that's a lot in a class. Right. And so last year we thought it was going to be, Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, Anthony Richardson, and Will Levis for sure. And then, we'll throw Hendon Hooker in on top. In the 2019 class, it's going to be Kyler Murray, Daniel Jones. It's going to be Drew Lock. No, it's not going to be Drew Lock. Dwayne Haskins. Yeah. But like we tend to overrate the quarterbacks who end up in the first round. And some of them, the 2022 class specifically was the huge example with Malik Willis, like you said, but we also had, the potential for Matt Corral, who's not even in the NFL anymore, like in there. Sam Howell, who ended up going in the 5th round. Like there was a lot of overestimating in that class specifically. And I don't want to use that as a rule of thumb. Like we're not going to just have one here, but we tend to overrate. And so to me, Penix and Nix are good prospects, but like not in the first round. I think if you get them in the second round, they're both on the older side. We call that experienced, seasoned. Nix has the RPO offense that, Mike in his, great Substack article on him called the micro passes, the amount of production that he had that was 0 air yards or less is like really high. And that's like, some of the offenses have some of that kind of style of offense has made it into the NFL, but not to that extent. You still need to be able to push the ball down the field. And so Penix was very good at that. Penix, his skill set that ranks to the top in this class, and this is the kind of analytics du jour a little bit, is this pressure to sack
the sack
ratio, where, Penix did a really good job in the advanced numbers. And this is one of the things that we've learned from the Pro Football Focus folks is a stat that is probably the most translatable for quarterbacks from college to pro is this sack avoidance number. And so in this class, Penix is at the kind of top of the class. And then of these top quarterbacks, the next quarterback who's, at the sack avoidance metric is Drake May. Okay. So there is some like amount of selection bias in this. So like Caleb Williams led the country probably in time to throw, just trying to run around. And so, some of those pressures will turn into sacks just because he allows for more pressures to happen because of how long he holds onto the ball. But just as a pure rate statistic, we see Michael Penix look really good in this stat going on the 2023 numbers. So that's a number that's a number that's solidly in Penix's profile if we think that type of thinking is making its way through the league. But I still think both of them will probably end up in the second round. At least that's kind of what I've seen based on my historical thinking.
You don't know, Benjamin. You don't know Hitchhiker's Pie says when hack avoidance carries over from college to the NFL, what the R squared values are. I don't know what the number
I mean,
is.
I don't
just
know what
that
it is
carries
either.
over.
It carries over, but the thing is, it's all relative too. So nothing is perfect. So, it depends on like what you're, in the social sciences, like a good amount of so R squared is just if we look at the college performance on one side and the professional performance on the other side, how much of the variance or the difference in the professional performance can be explained by the college performance. It's probably not just one variable, but you have to think about it in context. And so I don't know exactly what the number is, but relative to others, it's much more stable. And so, we have, for example, like the perfect example is Patrick Mahomes. That was a big underrated, actually, kind of trait that he had was sack avoidance, and that's actually carried over in college. And when we look at quarterbacks who have that problematic number, it's ones that you see like Zach Wilson, Justin Fields have had real struggles. And some of it is the selection bias with Fields, where he holds onto the ball too because he believes, and he does have a lot of athleticism. It's just athleticism only goes so far when, the pocket closes and you can't get downfield and you aren't a good thrower.
Another question from Matthew Carley. This is going more towards the bottom of the draft, but Ravens GM Eric DeCosta said this week that the class is small due to COVID together with the impact of NIL, and that the end of day 3 will be really poor as a result. Do we think there's any truth to that? Obviously, things are going to NIL. We are really in the early days of knowing what that's going to really do.
Yeah, that's what people have been saying about, why teams should be trading up in this class. And so, I'm sure that Eric DeCosta has a lot of good data on that. He has a really strong team at the Ravens. You also have to look at just the traditional, what's the historical success rate for day 3? And it's already really low. So you have to understand at what point would the success rate of a day 3 pick have to be? How much lower would it have to be anything in terms of statistically different than what the historical day 3 numbers have been anyway? And there's also this whole deal about the day 3 guys. How many of those day 3 players are basically similar quality to players who are undrafted anyway?
Right.
So a lot of there's a lot.
Well, a lot of the 6th and 7th round is basically just about getting your pick of those guys.
Yes.
Yeah.
Instead of having them go to undrafted and then you have to outbid other teams for them.
Yeah. So, but to me, when I think about that, there is potentially some truth that the high end of the class might not be as good. But then I also hear this is one of the best offensive tackle and wide receiver classes in years. And we have great amount of quarterbacks and the edge rushers. I like them too. And the cornerbacks are pretty cool. So there's always this sort of an excuse for pre-excusing the idea that this class could stink. But I don't believe that's the case. I mean, you look back at the 22 class when everyone said, oh, this class stinks. There's been a lot of good players to come out of that class. I mean, look at, Sauce Gardner being probably one of the better players in the NFL. I mean, and he was the 5th overall pick. Garrett Wilson's looked great. There are players that will succeed in this class despite the class not being as good. And but to me, there's maybe not as much of a huge difference historically between the day 3 hit rates and what we'll see this year. I mean, it also will take a lot of time for us to even understand what the hit rate is and even agree what a hit is. But in terms of what we expect from day 3 picks, the bar is really low.
This is kind of the last year of the COVID class moving through that had 5 years of eligibility that took the extra year. NIL's here to stay. That's going to be the adjustment that GMs have to make, is that guys are going to stay the 4th year in a lot of the big programs where they weren't necessarily staying the 4th year.
Or they're going to do a 4th year at a different program.
Different program, right.
Well, we're seeing that too with the Senior Bowl this year. The Senior Bowl for the first time allowed non-seniors to be a part of the proceedings. So you saw some, I think they're kind of taking advantage of that. Senior classes might be smaller in the future. Or maybe this was just a one-off thing, maybe to experiment because of how small the class was. Relatively speaking, with people returning to school for the extra years. I don't blame NIL as much. I blame the extra year. I think it's a much bigger deal where, you can kind of take an extra year. Most NIL deals are not that big. Right. You hear about some of the big ones, but the median NIL deal is probably 0 just because there's so many athletes in college and even on the football side. To me, the COVID extra year of eligibility was probably a bigger influence than we're making believe.
Let's talk about fallers. Let's go through the top 5 players that have been falling in the Grinding the Mocks data, and we'll do them one by one and then get Mike's thoughts on these players. So why don't you hit us with those, Benjamin?
So this is just in the top 50. So in my top 50, my top 5 fallers, Taliesin, probably, or Taliesin Fuanga, offensive tackle from Oregon State, who I really like a lot.
Yeah.
Chris Braswell, edge rusher from Alabama. Jackson Powers Johnson, interior offensive lineman from Oregon. Keon Coleman, wide receiver, Florida State, and Troy Franklin, wide receiver, Oregon. And that is, over the last month in the Grinding the Mocks, current players in the top 50, the top 5 followers.
Yeah, I like Fuaga a lot. I think he could be the best right tackle prospect since Lane Johnson, or he could have been if he was a little quicker and more consistent in that race. So I don't know if that's a lost in the shuffle thing with so many offensive linemen on boards, quarterbacks on boards, receivers moving up. Braswell's a guy. What do I have? I have it written here. I have my notes. Ordinary in so many areas. First step is doesn't have many moves. Get blocked easily.
Saxier doesn't like him.
Who doesn't like it?
Saxier doesn't like him.
Okay. I feel validated. And I have more slander. I'm going to skip that. I really like Jackson Powers Johnson. I think he's like somewhere between Travis Frederick and Creed Humphrey. Big fan. I think it's just the young man from Duke taking over as center one. Yeah. You're only going to put so many centers in a mock draft in the first round. You're probably going to give one to like the Cowboys, and you're going to give the best one,
Yeah, I think Barton has solidified himself there. I also think Powers Johnson is just, when you see historically, and this has just been a red flag for me when I look at my data, or I see one guy at a position, like safety or center, unless that guy is considered really good, like Tyler Linderbaum. Like everyone was like, oh man, Tyler Linderbaum's great, but I just don't know. But even when we had Creed Humphrey, he ended up going in the second or third round, and he was thought of as the top center. And people would just say like, oh, that team needs a lineman. He's the top center.
Right.
And so center is just not valued in the same way as even guard or offensive tackle.
And appropriately, if you look at the performance of players, guards and centers should go a little bit later than offensive tackles.
And so I think we're running into a little bit of the Zach Martin situation here, especially with Barton, but also with Troy Fautanu, and then also with Fuanga, where these guys could be good tackle prospects. Even Barton. I mean, I had Barton as a tackle prospect to watch ever since the beginning of the year. He's been in mock draft cycles the whole way in the first round.
Okay.
And so I think the versatility helps, but to me, I always want guys to fail at tackle before I put them at guard, because then they could become good at guard and then stick there. So like, for example, the Cowboys with moving on from Tyron Smith, they have Tyler Smith, who they drafted a couple years ago, who has been playing guard and been pretty good. And some people were like, oh, he should stay at guard. And I think some of that is risk aversion. Like, we already know he's good at guard, but if he stinks at tackle, that we don't want that. But the upside is so important. And so moving on from Tyron Smith means that you can put Tyler Smith at left tackle. And so, but that still took 2 years to happen. And so, teams like the Bengals, they have, they signed some big offensive linemen this year. They signed Trent Brown to play, right tackle now. And they have Orlando Brown on the other side. But, a lot of people have the Bengals looking at Troy Fautanu and then Fuanga as well, who I just mentioned, because they could play guard and be really good at guard, and then maybe play tackle this year or later on. So, but yeah, this whole, like, we think that he's like Fuanga could be really good guard, but like, what if he could be an amazing left tackle? And so, I always thought he fit in really well just on a team level with the Chargers. They want an offensive lineman. He run blocks super well, right. And they have an opening at right tackle, and he's a right tackle only. So that's perfect. But yeah, so to me, Fuanga, I think that teams are struggling to see maybe a fit outside of the Chargers. And if you have the Chargers trading down in some of your mock drafts, that could impact his landing spot.
Yeah. And Keon Coleman, I have from my notes. These are notes I wrote in February. Feels like a NFL wide receiver 3 who will get overrated because of his traits and highlights. He, of course, had a bad combine in terms of his 40 time. Yeah. A lot of like almost catches on Coleman's record. And Troy Franklin weighed 176 pounds at the combine. I have him with 7 drop passes in 2023. He ran well, obviously, but we're going to talk about Xavier Worthy in a moment, I think. I think he moved past him. I think when Ladd McConkey comes into and runs well and shows he's healthy, he kind of pushed Franklin down the board a little bit.
Coleman is interesting because his 40 was bad, but he did really well with the gauntlet.
That's right.
Which is where Puka Nacua really stood out.
Let's not compare everyone to Puka Nacua.
I don't want to compare him. I'm just saying in this one area.
Yeah. Josh Allen was bad in his first 2 years, but then got good.
let's not compare everyone to Puka, but you're right. Like, I think
In
that
this
potentially
one
the
area,
advanced,
the
the advanced metrics
similarity is
might
that
be
Puka
kind to
did not
Coleman.
have a good 40 time, but did very
Yeah.
well in the gong.
Yeah, right now he's kind of settled around in the 40s. And so like a team like, Houston will be around there. Cleveland as well, I think would be fans of him. You look at some of his advanced numbers, he also moved up, maybe you call it moving up. He went from Michigan State to Florida State.
Yeah.
The Florida State offense is a little weird. They have a lot of good prospects in this year's draft.
Yeah.
They have Coleman, they have Johnny Wilson, Trey Benson at running back.
Bell.
So
Yeah.
like, to me, like Coleman, I think is interesting. People thought of him really, really kindly before, and now I think that they're souring him because of just the combine, and then looking a bit at some of the profile where he compares more to like a N'Keal Harry maybe.
Yeah.
And so people don't like that, and so it makes sense to see him kind of fall in that perspective.
Benjamin, we can't compare everybody to N'Keal
I was
Harry.
going to say, that's a range. He could be Puka Nacua. He could be N'Keal Harry.
Hey, I never said he was going to be Puka Nacua.
That's a range. No, that's a range. Let's talk about 3 players who could surprisingly go in the first round, and then 3 possible first rounders who may fall to the second. So first, give us 3 players who could be surprise first round picks.
So players I have as surprise first rounders are right now outside of my Grinding the Mocks top 32. And so I have 3 guys. Peyton Wilson, linebacker, North Carolina State, also old, also injured, but everyone loves his tape. So sometimes that seems to win out. So I don't know. I just seen a lot of love for him from the tape folks. And so I think that I've seen him kind of inch up. And, last year we had Jack Campbell from Iowa, who, wasn't old and wasn't injured, but kind of surprised. And so sometimes there'll be some guys who kind of come up and surprise folks. And so,
taking
to me,
an overaged off-ball linebacker in the first round does not sound like a good decision to me, but I haven't watched the tape.
Exactly. Mike mentioned Xavier Worthy. Right now, he's slightly outside of my top 32. I expect him to get drafted. My friend Kevin Cole at the Unexpected Points Substack, has shown that the 40 is really predictive of draft position, but not predictive necessarily of, production in the NFL. And teams love to chase these 40s. So I wouldn't be surprised to see Xavier Worthy in the first round. And so I think people are just kind of slotting him to the Chiefs a lot at the end because him and Adonai Mitchell love the name as a Jew. But yeah,
I feel weird saying it.
It's better than Jerry Jeudy, who wore the Star of David at the Combine and explained that people called him Jew.
Yeah, all right.
But I respect it. But yeah, his people call him AD, so his middle name must be something with D. And so yeah, I see a lot of different things at play in his name that are cool. But yeah, Xavier Worthy, I think we're seeing a lot of him and a lot of AD Mitchell to the Chiefs. I think it's kind of uncreative in a way. I think that Xavier Worthy's range is a lot higher. And so I could see him going in the first round really solidly. And then another guy who I think is really interesting, really good pass blocker, Kingsley Suamataia, offensive tackle from Brigham Young. I could see him. I think offensive line of the Chiefs is like pretty solid. You can also see Jordan Morgan there from Arizona, but I put Suamataia because it gives me an opportunity to say his name out loud.
Suamataia, yeah, a very big guy, very quick-footed guy. Looked real good at the Senior Bowl. Kind of feels a little developmental to me, but like you can put a developmental guy on the Chiefs. You can put a developmental guy on the 49ers at the end of the draft and say this is going to be Trent Williams as heir apparent. So, and he is a high upside guy in a deep line class. You mentioned Worthy. We all know about the 40 time. He gives me the Big 12 heebie-jeebies when he's got a 15-yard cushion all the time.
Hey, SEC now. Respect the Texas SEC next year.
That's right. Yeah, right. He still gives me that big, that wide open program, heebie-jeebie. Looks a little like Devontae Smith at times. Looks a lot like Denzel Mims other times. Again, I don't know where he's going to go in the first round. What you said about predictivity sells, and the linebacker, Peyton Wilson. Yes, he's extremely old. The injuries are a little bit behind him, but the age is really something. Had a phenomenal combine. Looks very good on tape. He hits. He's a good blitzer, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, I'm not advocating for him in the first round. I think he's somebody who's going to play in the NFL for a few years, despite the fact that he's, 26 at this point.
Yeah, I've been removing him from my my data for the last 3 cycles. So I thought that he was just but then I've seen a lot of love. So yeah, to me, Worthy. The thing about him that he's fast, but also you have to remember he weighs 175 or something.
Yes.
So
That's what he was.
yeah.
He's very narrow. He's a narrow young man. I think it was 176 pounds.
Yeah.
And it's a highlight reel of you got a 15-yard cushion and you're running the stop. 15-yard cushion, run the stop. 15-yard cushion, run the stop. And that don't translate very well into the NFL because you don't usually get that cushion.
Yeah.
Let's talk about 3 players who could fall from the first round to the second round.
Yeah. So one I already mentioned, Jackson Powers Johnson. If there is a position that I see mocked once, really, you can say Barton's a center, but I think he's just viewed as an offensive lineman because of how versatile he is. But yeah, Jackson Powers Johnson, I think, will go in the second round. The other ones I have, Kool-Aid McKinstry, cornerback from Alabama, has kind of been falling the entire cycle.
That's kind of an injury thing, right?
The players who fall if you've been like ranked really high and then you fall, we tend to see like a lot of what we call anchoring bias. That people kind of, think like, oh yeah, he was that guy earlier, and we don't really truly get to see the full kind of fall that he's seeing in my numbers. So I tend to think that he might be a guy that falls out of the first into the second round, or maybe the third. And then the third one is Jerzon Johnny Newton, defensive tackle, Illinois. Never really thought of as the top defensive tackle in this class. He was at a certain point. Byron Murphy, not to be confused with cornerback from Washington, who came out in 2019. From Texas, the defensive tackle will be the top defensive tackle taken. And so to me, when I look at those numbers and I see who else is available on the defensive tackle front, you don't really see anything until you get into that second round with Darius Robinson from Missouri, who's kind of a tweener, and you get Braden Fisk and Chris Jenkins. So Fisk from Florida State and Jenkins from Michigan. And so to me, when I just see Murphy so far above, I kind of think like a guy who's kind of borderline second round, when there are guys in the second round who are solidly second round, might just end up falling into that second round group, kind of like a Christian Barmore.
I really like Murphy a lot, and I like Jerzon a lot. He had a foot fracture. He missed the combine. That's probably a big contributor here. Murphy also had Tavondre Sweat, his teammate at Texas, who I think is just a giant blocking sled for personally. But like he's Planet Theory sized guy, decent athleticism. I just don't like the tape very much. But like defensive tackle is not. I don't think it's super deep. I don't think it's a super high position to need around the NFL right now. And as Aaron said, Kool-Aid also had a foot injury. And I think that's just, there's a lot of good cornerbacks. Foot injury at cornerback does worry me, I think, more than other positions in that you wind up getting this lost rookie season. So I can see people like devaluing him as a result.
All right, one more question before we go. Matthew Carley wants to know what you think of Amarius Mims. Tiny sample size, he says, but moves like Jonathan Ogden.
Ooh.
Yeah. So Amarius Mims, offensive lineman from Georgia. I find him to be really, really intriguing. He's kind of solidly been in he's my 7th ranked offensive tackle right now. I think some of it is because there's a lot of uncertainty on him in terms of, like you said, when he played really well, but then he didn't play. Right. So I've heard that the Bengals really like his profile, young, athletic. There was a real small moment during the combine, I don't know if you remember, where people thought he ran some insane shuttle time, and then it turned out he didn't run the shuttle. It was just a data entry issue on the NFL. And so there was like some insane
modern world, baby.
There was some moment where it was like, oh my God, he ran like some insane shuttle time, and everyone was like, oh my God. Still really good athlete. And but yeah, so to me, people will bet on young, good athlete who they've seen some potential on a lot. And so it's not a bad I wouldn't put him at Jonathan Ogden level, because Jonathan Ogden was like, you take him top 5, no problem. And I don't think that Amarius Mims would be the first offensive tackle off of the board. I think that's still solidly going to be Joe Alt from Notre Dame. Although there was a time where I thought that if the draft was going to be static and things wouldn't change, that I thought that the Chargers would like Fuanga a lot, because Alt could play right tackle, but you probably want to stick him at left tackle because that's where he's going to be the best at. And but yeah, to me, Amarius Mims, intriguing. There's a lot of unknowns with him just because he didn't really test the whole way and he's been hurt. But the athleticism and the youth is something that a lot of people and a lot of teams will buy into, especially at premium position, offensive tackle.
Really big, really tall, really young, and can get low and can move. So that's a lot of things to like.
All right, that does it for our show, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us either on YouTube or listening to the podcast afterwards. Thank you to Benjamin Robinson. Grinding the Mocks is where you find him. Thanks to Mike, and we will be back next Thursday with another draft show at 11 a.m. Eastern, talking about all those old Football Outsiders projection methods and what they say about this year's players. So until then, next Thursday, 11 a.m. Eastern, and until then, so long, everybody.